I want to introduce to you our speaker, who is probably one of the most important people who has ever spoken here. Crowston is the Executive Director and Chief Curator of the Art Gallery of Alberta. She's joined the gallery in 1997. From 1994 to 1997, she was the Director and Curator of the Walter Phillips Gallery at the Banff Centre and the editor of the Walter Phillips Gallery edition. Prior to that, she was assistant curator at the Art Gallery of York University in Toronto and was both the editor and chair of the board of directors of Fuse magazine in Toronto. In 2019, she served on the curatorial team for the Canada Pavilion at the 2019 Venice Biennale, which featured the work of the Inuit film and video collective Isuma. In 2016, she was the commissioner for the Canada Pavilion of the Venice Biennale of Architecture and was Canadian commissioner for the Sydney Biennale of Contemporary Art in 2002. In that same year, she was awarded the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts Medal for Outstanding Achievement in the Visual Arts and the City of Edmonton Salute to Excellence Award in 2005. In 2015, she was inducted into the City of Edmonton Cultural Hall of Fame. So this is going to be pretty exciting. And just so that all of you know how important this is, I mean, most of you know by now, but Venice Biennale is like world's most important international contemporary art exhibition, and each nation is assigned a spot to assemble their pavilion. So the architecture and the artist that's highlighted is quite representative of that country. So the whole idea of politics of representation goes hand in hand with the concept of Venice Biennale. With that said, please join me in welcoming Catherine Crowston.
Sorry, I have to leave my stuff. Oh, and I have a speech somewhere. Oh, there it is. Okay. So thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. And I don't really believe I'm the most important here today. And as I mentioned to Tanya just now, I am located just downtown, so I didn't actually travel very far to get here either. So what I thought I would do is when Sean invited me to speak, it was back in the fall of last year, and we had just, the Canadian Pavilion in Venice was still open, and I think Sean wanted me to speak about the two Venice projects that I've worked on, the 2016 Venice Biennale in Architecture, and then the 2019 Venice Biennale in Art. And so maybe before I begin, just how many people in the room have been to the Venice Biennale? Oh, that's good, a lot of you. And oh, hi, Nadia. And how many, I actually bumped into Nadia in Venice last time we were there, so that's fun. And how many people have heard of it? Oh yeah, okay, great, we're good, okay. And so how many people know that Venice Biennale has its art component as well as its architecture component? Okay, great. So they happen in alternating years. Odd years are the Art Biennale and even years are the Architecture Biennale. And maybe what I'll do is just, I have a kind of written selection, a written component about the Architecture Biennale, which I'll start with first because it happened earlier, and also kind of leads into Isuma's project in a quite interesting way, I think. But I'm also going to talk about some kind of problematics of working in Venice, because it's really unlike any other kind of exhibition situation that you might encounter. So, okay, so I'm going to read a little bit, and I'm going to maybe flip through a few slides. So for your background, the Venice Biennale of Architecture is actually not as old as the Venice Biennale of Art. It began in 1980 when the first international architecture exhibition was held in Venice, directed by Paul Portuguese. During the previous decade, architecture had been trying to make its way inside the visual arts scene and in the visual arts part of the Biennale, and subsequently they decided to create its own separate Biennale, as I said, in the even years. And we also know now that there's a Venice Biennale of Dance, there's a Venice Biennale of Film, so there's a number of things that the Biennale has been doing to expand its reach and also, quite honestly, expand tourism in the city of Venice. As if Venice needs more tourists. But, so the architect that I worked with was an architect named Pierre Bélanger, and his firm is called Opsis. Pierre is actually originally from Montreal, and he's a landscape architect as opposed to the architect of buildings. He is a Canadian-American landscape architect and urban planner. He completed his doctoral studies on infrastructural environments and state systems at the Life Sciences University of Wageningen in the Netherlands. Prior to this, he completed graduate studies for a Master in Landscape Architecture at Harvard University and did his undergraduate work at the University of Toronto. He's a registered landscape architect in Canada, the USA, and in the Netherlands, and he currently teaches and writes on its subjects at the intersection of territory, history, infrastructure, media, conflict, and power. In 2001, he founded his project office, Open Systems, also known as OPSIS. So the project that Pierre created was in response to Canada's contemporary culture and global economy of resource extraction. Canadian transnational corporations currently operate close to 10,000 mining operations worldwide in nearly every country, continent, and ocean on the planet. So this is just a map of Canadian mining operations, and this was back in 2016, so it's quite possible it's larger than this. Yeah. His work for the Venice Biennale was a multimedia initiative which explored the current and historic legacy of resource extraction from a Canadian perspective. Extraction examined Canada's role in extracting the resources that fuel our cities. And as Pierre says, Canada has become a global resource empire. We are now the preeminent extraction nation on the planet. Bélanger's project asks us to reconsider Canada's image as a pacifist nation. He imploring that we need to understand that essentially our mode of consumption, our mode of living is entirely based on the separation from the means of production and the territories of extraction. Your life depends on territories in other places where we extract resources. Extraction is a process and practice that defines Canada at home and abroad. Producing over 60 million, that's the Biennale, okay, I'll come back to that. Producing over 60 minerals and metals, Canada is the most productive mining nation in the world. Of the nearly 20,000 mining projects in the world, from Africa to Latin America, more than half are Canadian operated. Not only does the mining economy employ close to 400,000 people in Canada, it contributed $52.6 billion to Canada's GDP in 2012 alone. Globally, more than 75% of the world's mining firms are based in Canada. Seemingly impossible to conceive the scale of these statistics naturally extends the logic of Canada's historical legacy as a state nation and now as a global resource empire. So the question many people asked is, what is the relationship of resource extraction to architecture? Pierre Bélanger's project was an attempt to explain to Canada why practices of mining and extraction should be understood for their architectural implications. Bélanger says design disciplines need to stop fetishizing the large mega-scale of mining and territorial infrastructure, and they need to stop appropriating indigenous cultures in order to understand and internalize the deep political sovereignties of the lands that they are invited to work on. For Bélanger, it is these systems of exploitation and the corollary lack of awareness or outright disregard for indigenous sovereignty and critically territorial knowledge that have led to the morass of the climate crisis we now find ourselves submerged in. Rarely do any of the environmental complexities that we are addressing today, such as drought, high water, extreme participation, and storm action, as well as species invasion, conform to any form of geometric, linear, legal, or jurisdictional boundaries. So according to Bélanger, we have come to the limits of the map, or the property, or the plan. For Bélanger, addressing these problems demanded a total reconceptualization of how to design the built environment and how they operate. It demands that we think critically about the way land is understood, measured, and modeled, and that we engage with those that help, that shape it. He sees the most promising way forward landscape architecture for its skill and design of open spaces, but also its capacity to reform 20th century urban design, reclaim biophysical processes, repair damaged watersheds, and reconstruct critical ecosystems. He sees the project of landscape architecture within the field of architecture as a marginalized design discipline, fighting the oppression of marginalized people and marginalized territories to displace the supremacy of the colonial metropolis as the dominant center. So I'm going to quote a bit from the press release, which says, opening a wider lens on the cultures of extraction, the project intends to develop a deeper discourse on the complex ecologies of resource extraction. From gravel to gold, across highways and circuit boards, every single aspect of contemporary urban life today is mediated by mineral resources. Through the multimedia language of film, print, and the exhibition, the landscape of resource extraction, from exploration to mining to processing to construction to recycling and reclamation, is explored and revealed as the bedrock of our contemporary life. So that is the thinking behind the project that Pierre did. And so now what I'm going to do is walk you through in a kind of more informal way the process of how the project actually happened and what in the end we presented in Venice. So here is a map of the main focuses of the Biennale. There is the Giardini, which is at the very southern end of the Venice kind of island. And also connected is the Arsenale, which is the old shipbuilding area in Venice. And originally, Pierre had a plan. And well, here's a little aerial view, so that gives you a sense of more what it's like. So here's the Grand Canal, the opening to the Venice Lagoon. Oops. Bye-bye. Oh, we're back. Okay. I'm going to walk over there. The Grand Canal comes down, the garden is here, and the Canadian Pavilion is right here at the very tip of the Giardini. And there is the opening up to the lagoon, and the Arsenale is back up in here. And as I said, the Arsenale is a really, really big historical shipbuilding site. So it has vast kind of areas in which Venetians used to build the ships. So Pierre's original idea was that he wanted to do something in the Arsenale. And this is where he wanted to site his work, in one of the large shipbuilding bays. And because he wanted to do a multimedia project and a kind of extraction project, he wanted to create a pile of gold ore. That, as you can see, I believe that's the CN Tower, for those of you who've been in Toronto. San Marco Basilica. He wanted to build a pile of gold ore bigger than St. Mark's, which is quite something. And there's kind of a sense of a scale. So this is actually, his idea was based on actual piles of gold ore that they were found in mining companies all around the world. But I'm not sure where this one is actually taken, but this is basically the kind of idea that he wanted to bring to Venice, this entire huge amount of gold ore. And there's how it would have been, how big it would have been in comparison to St. Mark's. And of course, it wouldn't be sited there. It would have been sited in the grounds of the Arsenale. So, as you can imagine, the Venice authorities said, no, it's not going to happen. And so part of the challenge of working in Venice, or part of the protocol of working in Venice, is that there's very many different levels of approvals. So the first approval is with the Biennale authority itself. The Venice Biennale has authority over what works are going to be presented, the context they're going to be presented. So you have to get approval from the Venice Biennale authority. If you're going to do something that's outside of the pavilions and the Giardini, then you need to have approval of the city. And the city of Venice does not want a huge pile of gold ore in anywhere near anything. It's very clear. So both the Biennale authority, who control the Giardini and the Arsenale grounds during Biennale time, said no. So Pierre had to rethink what he was going to do. Oh, and then there was going to be a big film. So the big film was going to be projected in one of these shipbuilding bays on a big large screen, and it would be visible during the day and night. It would be like a super great like drive-in experience, although there's no cars. Super great walk-in film experience. In the end, none of that happened. None of that could happen. And then the other challenge that we were told at the beginning of the project is that the Canadian Pavilion was going to be closed for renovation. So we couldn't do what we wanted to do in Arsenale for obvious reasons, and also at that point we weren't allowed to use the pavilion. And I have some images of the pavilion that are coming up when we begin to talk about Isuma, but we'll get to that. So the challenge was, should we find another venue? How can we not use the pavilion? We're not going to work in Arsenale. And in Venice, many people know that in the Giardini itself, there's only 32 countries that have pavilions. Canada was very fortunate to get a pavilion after the Second World War as part of a kind of war reparations exchange with the Italian government. So our pavilion is actually very well sited. It's between the German pavilion and the British pavilion. It's on a nice hill. It has a nice little garden at the back. It's a really, really difficult structure because it's shaped like a nautilus shell, which you can kind of see in this rendering here. It also has glass all on the interior side and, strangely enough, a tree growing out of the middle of it. So it's a very interesting pavilion, but at this point we couldn't use that anyway. So what Pierre and I worked on was trying to capture the idea of what he wanted with the presence of the gold ore and the video film component. And in the end, what we made, well, there's Pierre, was iron ore, gold ore, but to suit the requirements of the Venice authority as well as the city, we had to bag it all. So no raw ore could touch the ground at all. So all the ore came up from Sardinia on a barge, and we bagged it, and it was presented in these bags that formed a wall that blocked the Canadian Pavilion. So when you were in Venice, your normal approach to the pavilion was blocked, and there was no access to the pavilion, and all there was a solid wall of gold ore. There were 45 tons, actually, 30 bags of 1.5 tons each, so 45 tons of ore. And that kind of gives you a sense of what it looked like as you walked up to it. Or there's a better. So there's the kind of structure of the Canadian Pavilion in the back, and this is the British Pavilion here. And it was very interesting because people were so used to going into the pavilions that even though it was blocked, everybody tried to go around the big bags of ore. And it was a very funny experience to watch them. So there is what the actual ore looks like in those bags as they're being filled and sealed. And there's a kind of little microscope. So you can see, and there was, maybe back on here, well, we'll see, we'll just go forward. All of the ore had a sign on it that says 1 part per billion, 1 per billion, because that's how much gold is actually in your ore sample. So imagine you need 1 billion tons of ore to get 1 ton of gold or something, if you want to make it that kind of a gross math calculation. So then, here, as I said, is the German Pavilion, the Canadian Pavilion, the British Pavilion, and the French Pavilion. So our nice colonial friends around us. And then Pierre found this spot that was kind of this nexus of where these lines from the different pavilions meet. And he put a survey stake there that connected all the pavilions. And the survey stake, so that's kind of what it looks like. There, it was gold. It was a solid gold survey stake that we embedded into the ground. And then underneath of it, in the ground, was the video. So you basically had to, and there was a world map. So you can't really see it here, but there's a hole in the middle. There's a stake there. A map of the world, the survey stake in a kind of place, I believe, in northern Canada. And then to see the video, you had to, this is the opening, we covered it with beaver pellets, but I could just, okay, maybe I'll go back. Hold on a second. So Oh, and then we gave out, everybody who came got a bag of gold ore that they could take home with them. And each bag of gold ore was, I don't know, like a quarter, I don't know how much gold would have been there, not very much, because each bag of ore was only about 200 or 300 grams. And that's what that was like. So we covered the map, for the opening, we covered the map with beaver pelts. And the woman's name I was looking for is Ariel Deranger, I don't know, from At the Bath Fortune Home. She came and did the opening ceremony and did a song and a poem. So there's and then here's the opening. And then we removed there's Ariel in the background. And then people actually, to watch the video, had to get down on their hands and knees and look through the little gold spike to see the video. So every person had to do it individually. So it really shifted from the original project description of it being this massive kind of drive-in sized movie screening. It became a very personal, individual experience, and people lined up, and it had to be one by one by one. There was a video of it, which I have, and I'll show you. But also it made people prostrate themselves and kind of be on the ground, close to the ground in a way perhaps that great big huge video would not have done. But I think Pierre's concept about kind of moving away from the spectacular mega project really made a lot more sense in a way, because it was much more of a personal experience with you and the ground, quite physically. So some people, she chose to stand on her head. I'm not sure how much she could see, but some people, lay down. Some people, as that previous one, were kind of more crouched over. The headstand girl, I'm not quite sure how she did that. But maybe now what I'll do is I'll play, here's that's the video. So this is what you would see. Should I turn it up? It's good.
Europeans first set foot on North American soil.
Years from now, my people will be forced to live in mobile homes on reservations. Your people will wear cardigans and drink highballs. We will sell our bracelets by the roadsides. You will play golf and enjoy hot hors d'oeuvres. My people will have pain and degradation. Your people will have stick shifts. The gods of my tribe have spoken. They have said, do not trust the pilgrims. And for all these reasons, I've decided to scalp you and burn your village to the ground.
Anyway, so part of the text you just heard was Ariel Deranger with a poem that we opened the pavilion with. So one of the interesting things about the project, which I think we knew about a little bit as we went forward, was the fact that Pierre and Extraction were officially representing Canada, yet the entire project was critical of Canada and its history and its kind of current role in the world. So we didn't receive any direct negative feedback. I think there was concern because the Canadian ambassador from Rome was up and there was a lot of Canadian delegates and politicians there. But in the end, I think that almost everybody, I don't think there was any negative criticism that we anticipated. And the irony of it all was, in the end, the pavilion wasn't renovated till a year later, so we actually could have done something in the pavilion after all, but in the end, I think the project was really quite successful, and Pierre said of it, it's not a pavilion, it was a counter pavilion. So that's why I'm happy with that. So that brings me to the Venice Biennale of 2019, which just closed in November of last year. And as was mentioned in the introduction, the artists that were selected to represent Canada for 2019 are the Inuit cooperative Isuma. So some people might ask, how do I see these two projects relating to each other? And I think it's really important to understand where Isuma comes from and what their larger practice is to understand how important or how influential mining is to them and to the lives of Inuit people. And in 2019, Baffinland's Iron Mines expansion project proposed a railroad that would cut across Baffin Island to ship 30 million tons of iron ore annually by supertanker, cutting through walrus breeding and traditional hunting grounds. So in addition to the feature film work that Isuma is known for, they have long been involved in documentary production, but also in media activism, trying to give voice and share information with communities across northern Canada. Their work demonstrates endurance and resistance to Canadian colonial cultural policies, using media to preserve endangered Indigenous languages, fight for access to bandwidth, and for fair play in the media environment, and provides a forum for engaging with multinational mining in Nunavut with a hope to end its exploitation of both people and land. So I'm going to have to switch my PowerPoint now if I can paperboard. Oh, there. That one. Uh-oh. So how do I get to that? The name, Minister of Finance is going to appear. Oh, no. Okay, now I need to technical. Resume slideshow. Hey, there we are. So this is the opening of the Canada Pavilion in May of 2019. It's interesting that we're opening the show of Isuma with the Minister of Finance, Bill Moreau, and also the head of RBC Bank, who was a sponsor. So obviously we're still acknowledging those people. And the two people on the podium, on the kind of stage right now, are two representatives from Isuma and the kind of gathered assembly. So we were fortunate to be able to work in the pavilion after its renovation. The pavilion hadn't been renovated, I think, since, well, probably 1970s. And, but the challenge was what work we wanted to show. And really, I have to say, that the curatorial team consisted of 5 people, which is the first time that's really ever happened in the history of Canada's participation in Venice. The 5 curators were myself, Candace Hopkins, who's there in the green jacket, who is currently the curator of the Toronto Biennale. Barbara Fisher from the University of Toronto Art Museum, who I can't see in there. José Durand-Brisebois, who's Senior Curator of Contemporary Art at the National Gallery of Canada, and Isuma, who is an Inuit filmmaker and emerging curator, who lives in Montreal, but is originally from Inuit, and she has been working on Isuma's archive for a number of years, so she's quite knowledgeable. And Isuma, I can't see her there either. So that's the opening, and as you can see, we're using the, oh yes, so there's a lineup. Canada Pavilion never really gets lined up, so we're really happy that we have a lineup. But the challenge was Isuma wanted to make, for the pavilion, a feature-length film. And for those of you who've been to Venice, you might understand that people's attention span is quite short because they have so many pavilions to see and so much to do and so little time. Because really, I think if one were actually to see all of the Venice Biennale, it would probably take like 7 days or something, and most people would give themselves 2 or 3. And everyone's trying to get to see everything fast. And meanwhile, in the Canada Pavilion, we had a 2.5-hour film. Not just a feature-length film, but 2.5-hour length film. So our big challenge was how to present it, and how to present it in a way that was true to Isuma's work and true to the presentation and not kind of gimmicky. And at one point, we were going to build a hammock at the front of the pavilion, and people were going to have to go through the hammock to get into the pavilion, which is like a Inuit stone foundation building. And we decided not to do that, that it would be too gimmicky. And then at some point, there was going to be an oil lamp. Anyway, so everything went away. And in the end, we probably did the most simple thing, which was just to put in a bunch of big, huge screens. That is Zacharias Canuck, who is the main kind of writer, director, and filmmaker for Isuma. Most all of the films, or their feature-length films, are written and directed by Zacharias. And many of you may know they kind of came to international recognition with their film Antonarja with the Fast Runner, which was the first feature-length film produced entirely in Inuktitut. And the film that they made this new film, and I'm not going to show it to you, but we're going to see. Hold on, what's that? This is the opening. Zacharias refused to come to the opening because it was hunting season. And he didn't want to not be around for the hunt. So he said, there's no reason I need to be there. I need to hunt, I need to be up here, and it's going to be too hot in Venice, and I'm not going to. So what I'm showing you now is not the film itself, but a big component of the project that was the part I was in charge of was something called Silicate Livestream. And we had the feature-length film, which I'll talk about in a minute, but the other thing we did was live streaming from Inuit. So it was really exciting because we did Norman Cohn, who also works with Isuma, and Zacharias, programmed a series of events that we live streamed to Venice. But also because it was live streaming on the internet, it could be seen anywhere so long as you could sign on. So we actually had, probably have oh yeah, so that's what the pavilion looked like. It essentially, in the Nautilus shell with the windows, we had these large screens, and there were 5 videos, 1 in French, 1 in Italian, and 3 in English. But the film itself is in English and in Inuktitut, so it goes back and forth. So all the films are subtitled anyway because of the language shifting. And people stayed and they watched this film for 2 hours, 2.5 hours. And then this is so for the live streaming, you would cut into the actual film, and it would be Zacharias doing a number of different things. For the opening, he had an elder circle, and they talked, and they spoke in Inuktitut, and we had a live interpreter translating what they were talking about. Other times, they went to the Maryland mine hearings. There was a lot of environmental hearings happening in the north, and so we live broadcast them. There was a Inuit games that we live broadcast. Actually, the most amazing thing we did, though, which cost a huge amount of money, but we took the camera in a glulik out to the flow edge of where the ice was melting on the flow edge for a seal hunt. And I don't think there's ever been a live stream camera from the Arctic flow edge to around the world, essentially.
Wow.
And then we also did a film series that I programmed. So that was part of my work, was to work on the live streaming and the film series. So we kind of divided up on the curatorial team who did what different things. And then we did the live streaming in the gallery at the AGA the whole time. So we had in the gallery this television that was dedicated to a Isuma live stream. And every time there was a live stream happening, we also screened it at the same time. Well, obviously because it's live stream. Anyway, so. I don't know, when am I supposed to stop talking? Now? I'm back to that. How did I get used to that? I think that might be the end of that. Anyway, so there's Zach, and he's obviously, he was speaking in Inuktitut, and I don't think you can hear the translator because she was live in the room at the time. So, I guess what I just maybe wanted to say is that the project, I think, is in keeping with the key messages of Isuma, and also, the film. I didn't talk about film. Right. So the film that they made is a brand new feature film entitled One Day in the Life of Noah Piagaptuk. It is, if you know Isuma's work, their work can range from, as I mentioned, documentary to historical reenactments to fiction. And it was a fiction film, but based on the true life story of a man named Noah Piagaptuk who died in 1996. But Noah was one of the last remaining nomadic hunters, Inuit people living on the land. And the film recreates an encounter that happened in May of 1961 between Noah and what they were then called an Indian agent, or a kind of representative of the Canadian government, who was up in the north making people relocate from the land to the towns. So it's a very long conversation between Noah, the Indian agent in the movie who's only called the boss, he's just the boss. And then there's also another Inuk translator who actually is a bit of comic relief because he translates as he feels what the other person wants to hear. So, and it's a really very tense confrontation between the boss who I think really believes that he's doing Noah good by moving his family to a town. He's doing something good for him. He's going to provide school for the children. They're going to create opportunities for them to have money by doing guided tours and things like that for other hunters or etc. And Noah just does not want to move, but doesn't even understand why do the children need to go to school, because they learn everything from the land.
Yeah.
They learn everything from the people. They learn everything they need to know to survive here on the land. They don't need to go to your school. And also, why would they need money? They don't need to buy these things. So it would, and in the end, Noah returns home. But what we know from the real life story, because at the very end there's an interview with Noah himself, is that they're forced to relocate and they're forced to move into town. And it basically ends Inuit nomadic life and traditional lifestyles completely. So that's the sad part. Anyway, the film is, as I said, available, or it's available on YouTube, so you can watch it. And part of the thing that we did, which is also really, I think, really interesting and very much about what Isuma is about, as soon as we opened the pavilion, which was the premiere of the film, it went live on the internet. So Isuma didn't want people to have to go to Venice to watch it. They didn't want people to have to wait for it to be premiered at the film festival. They wanted it to be immediately online available and accessible. And I think for them, that concept of media democracy is really, really important. And so, we should be looking at Zach. But anyway, that was the Venice project. Is that right? 6 o'clock? Am I supposed to finish at 6? Yes. I'll put it back on Zach. I don't know how to do that, but maybe. So, now maybe there might be questions. Oh, do you have any? Oh, we're not. No, everyone will not. Turn that off. Turn that off. Bye. Okay. Oh, there. Oh, it's on. Okay, whatever. So, if you want, if you go online to www.isuma.ca or .tv actually, you can see all of Isuma's work, all of their television work, all of their documentary work, all of their fiction work. You can also see one of the things that they've been doing. One of the really other important things that they've been doing is they've been collecting indigenous language films from around the world. So on their website, you also have access to, I think, about 300 indigenous films in different indigenous languages. They're really trying to create a global and public forum for the presentation and indigenous film, but also indigenous language preservation. So it's probably part of what they do. So they're artists, but they're also media activists, they're filmmakers, they're community builders, they are really exciting. And one of the really great things is when they started off working in the early 1990s, they made a television series called Our Land, or Nunavut, and it was really about making Inuit TV for Inuit people. So making television by Inuit people for Inuit people. And a lot of what they did is recreate historical events. And in doing that, they also recreated traditional craft and traditional objects. And so one of the really exciting things was that part of the legacy of Isuma now is that they were also, I think you can also say they're largely responsible for a revival of traditional craft making through the idea of making props for their films. But there we go. Okay, now questions. Should we do the